Welcome back everyone, I'm AJ Barce, and in this tutorial I'm going to walk you through the basics of Affinity Publisher, which is kind of the InDesign alternative that I mentioned in my alternative AV presentation quite a while back. So when we get started with Affinity Publisher, it's a lot like if we were setting up something in InDesign. Now, Affinity Publisher is basically your standard desktop publishing software, and it can be quite jarring to go from InDesign, something that we have muscle memory with, to something like Affinity Publisher. But essentially, the apps are the same. And as of I think they call it the 1.8 update, Affinity Publisher also has some support with old IDML, InDesign Markup Language files that you may already have from INDD, files from previous projects. Now, there are some limitations because INDD files are proprietary to Adobe. IDML, however, the markup language, you may even have used other apps that use this before, like Scribus. Desktop publishing software has been around for decades. So getting started, you're going to get started no differently than you've done before in something else. So when you start up a new document, typically what we're used to is print and web. And the big difference between these two is the fact that print is going to have your common sizes internationally. So for instance, you have your A6 or A5, and as you scroll down, you'll also have some in inches. So for instance, if we look in here, we're looking for tabloid, right? This is something that we typically do 11 by 17. Well, let's see. I don't see one. There it is. They call it ledger. We're going to go ahead and click on ledger. Over here on the right, we have a layout panel. So 11 by 17, we can specify a dots per inch. Document units. I have mine set to inches. By default, I believe they have it set for centimeters when you first get started. This is how you're able to change your units, especially if you're not used to doing it in points, picas, or metric. You can change your orientation if we're doing it horizontal or vertical. We can specify how many pages we want, and if we want to enable a default master sheet, this is something that we are used to even in InDesign. I'm going to go ahead and do a 4-page spread. We're going to go ahead and turn on facing pages. We're going to arrange horizontal, and notice that our color format. So no differently than when we used to do it in InDesign, when we specify for things for print or for the web, we have two different color palettes we're dealing with. RGB, which stands for red, blue, green, and we also have CYMK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, which is typically what we will use when we are doing print, largely because we get a bigger color spectrum. And then, of course, I can come in here and change my margins should we need to do that. I'm going to go ahead and just say 1-inch margins all around, maybe this 1.25 at the bottom. Bleeds, if you're used to doing bleeds, if you're doing print proofing, this is where you'd be able to set your inner and outer top and bottom bleeds for your graphics so that when finishing happens, you have that full bleed graphic when they cut. Let's go ahead and say that this is what I want to do, and we're going to go ahead and hit create. So great, we now have an 11 by 17 layout, and we also have a centerfold double truck in the center, and then we have our front and back, as it were. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and just take a walk through the interface so that we kind of get used to what this looks like. So when we first get started, this is relatively pretty much the same as InDesign. Across the top, we don't have an attributes bar like we're used to in InDesign, but we do have a toolbar over on the left-hand side. Now, this toolbar, you have your selection tool or your direct select tool, or what they call their node tool. And just like we know in InDesign, all of these tools have key shortcuts. So for instance, as I hover, I'll get a pop-out tool tip, and I can see that node tool is the A for white arrow tool. The black tool is the V, which is your select tool. We have our text frame tool, which would be our text box tool. And then we also have our artistic text tool, and I'll cover these in a little bit. We have our pen tool, so we can do our basic pen for shaping. We have this is really cool. We actually have a tool for shapes, and you can use these as frames, or you can use these as just vector shapes that you can fill or stroke. Then, well, of course, we have our placeholders. We have our rectangular placeholder tool, and we have our circular placeholder tool. We have our place image tool, and this is something I want to get out of the way because typically speaking, you have this muscle memory since you've first ever opened up InDesign, Command D, okay, or Control D, which is the place tool. In Affinity Publisher, it is actually Command Shift M for your place tool. And I'll explain why that is in a little bit, but if you're looking for that, this is also the same tool where you would be able to place. They have it right there in the toolbar, so you don't have to know that key command. Now, this toolbar can be completely customized. So if you're like me and a lot of when you work is highly revolved around the workspace that you built. Now, and this is something that was something that Adobe did well, is that under our window or view, I can't remember, in InDesign, we had this workspacing tool where we would be able to set up a workspace so that the tools that we commonly use would be there and we could swap in between, for instance, topography and layout. In Affinity Publisher, they don't have that quite yet, but they do have the ability to customize both the toolbar, which is the top bar, and your tools, which is the toolbar that we commonly know on the left-hand side. If we go to view, we can customize toolbar, which is this top part up here, and this is where you're able to drag, drop, reorder anything that is across the top here. Now the other part is the tool set over here. So if we go back to our view, toolbars across the top, tools is on the left hand side. When we hit that, we're able to add, rearrange, and drop anything that we want in the order that we want. So for instance, if we know that we use the cat tool, we could take and drag that and put it in here, and I could commonly use that tool. So going across the rest of the interface, this looks fairly like we're at home. We have our master pages, which are up here. And one thing that I like about it is that I can also cascade my pages and master pages, so I don't have to have them visibly here. Of course, we can adjust how much that real estate happens by just grabbing this border right here. Master pages, again, if you don't remember what this is the common thing that we have kind of built into the background of a sheet. So for instance, if you have a header or a footer and you don't want to deal with it in your page layout, which is the content that we're creating on our individual pages, you're able to put it as a master sheet. Now, as we use a tool, this top bar right here is kind of our attributes bar. It'll change based off the tool that we're using because the tools dictate what options we get. Over on the right hand side, these are our panels or palettes, and these are pretty common that we're used to. We have our colors, swatches, layers. You can do layers and such, text styles and paragraph, and all of these you can rip out as an individual tab as a free floating panel, or you can set them back in and nest them, and that's what I typically like to do. In my workflow, I typically kind of work fairly minimally, so I usually keep my color and layers, character, paragraph, and text styles, I'll keep all in one subpanel. And then transform, navigator, and history. Yes, we do have history, so you can go back in time without having to do a whole bunch of Command Z's by using this panel down at the bottom. And this is typically how I prefer to do a lot of things. Now, the other thing that I want to point out is as we're setting up this layout, no differently than in InDesign, the old asterisk right by the name of the document dictates that we have not saved. In Affinity, we have this nice little window right here, and this is kind of your background tasks window as well. If we're importing content, this will also tell you that it's importing or what it's doing in the background. And we can see that the name of this, the percentage again of what we're in at Zoom, this is no differently than in the parentheses of the bar within InDesign or any of the Adobe suite. And then an asterisk over to the right means that we haven't saved, a little nod. I'm going to go ahead and hit Command S, and I'm going to go ahead and save this really quick. Test for this workshop. And you'll notice that again, that asterisk goes away. Anytime we do anything, that asterisk will show up to remind you to save. And then we see the name of what we're doing. Now, bear in mind, and I'll put a screenshot up here, whenever we work in any application, friends don't let friends trust autosave. Yes, Affinity Publisher is saving in the background, but hit that controller Command S as often as you can. Now, you'll see in the screenshot that I have here, when you do have a failure, it's inevitable. All apps inevitably fail, and Affinity is no different. And then immediately relaunch Publisher, and it will give you this tooltip so that you can try to do a recovery. Again, I always encourage you to hit Command S as often as possible. So next, the other thing that we'll notice over here on the left-hand side next to our pages and master pages, we have this other tab called Assets. Assets are kind of like the InDesign library feature. Now, if you're coming from journalism, you probably have your flags and your pull quotes and stuff already pre-built in an INDL, InDesign library. You cannot import IDNL at this time into Affinity Publisher. You will have to rebuild them. Once you do, you can drag and drop anything that you build into your assets, and this will act as a library. This is something that I made in a different entirely different publication. And once you have it in your assets over here, it's unified across the Affinity publisher ecosystem. If you build something, how do you bring it in as an asset? Well, anything can be an asset. It can be a text box with maybe you have some defined styles. Notice that across the top, we still have our character and paragraph styles. So you can still build correctly by denoting what styles you do so that you can design once. And if you need to change a style like a font or maybe a point size, you can just update that style and it'll unify it across the document. So for instance, I wanted to change InDesign into something kind of groovy and cool. I'm going to go ahead and say, let's do that. And when I do that, you'll notice that heading 1 now has this plus. I can come in and I can either create a new style, or I can come over here and update paragraph style. And what that will do is it'll apply what I've done here back to heading 1 for me. So now by doing that, you notice that everything else changed to that heading 1. Now let's say I didn't want to do that for my paragraph. Let's say I wanted to take this and adjust it as a character style. Well, I can go ahead and either apply something that I've done before, or I can create a new style based off of what is highlighted. And I can just call this InDesign flat. And you can tell that it pulls no differently than InDesign what we have highlighted: Apple Gothic and normal. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, and now I have that character style committed so that if I wanted to do something else, I could highlight it, come up to my style, and apply that InDesign flat that I designed before. So again, using your character styles and also using your paragraph styles are going to save you a lot of time, especially if you have to make a change. So let's say we've updated this header or flag, and I want to bring it in as an asset to use later. Real simple. Take, drag, drop. And now you have that asset as a library. You can also rename these. I've created one that's just called logo. You can also come in, rename. You can also create a new category. So much like the library function that we know in InDesign. So let me go back and let's take a look at pages versus master pages. I want to go ahead and click on this because I don't want it on my page per se. I want this baked in to my master page for my cover. I'm going to go ahead and hit delete. I'm going to go up to my master pages instead. And master A has been applied to all of these. No differently than in InDesign, whenever we set a master page, we can just click and drag it across all of these pages to set it. In this case, what I'm going to do is create a new master page. I'm going to call this cover master. And I did that by clicking this icon over here. I'm going to make it a single page because I'm just doing it as a cover. And I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And now I have a cover master page. When I double click on this, I'm now editing that page. And this is where the differentiation between master sheets and pages come in. So for my cover master, what I'm going to do is make my cover. I'm going to go to my assets. I'm going to make that build that I did. I'm going to drag and drop it in. Cool. Now, as I come over, I can see it within my master page, but I do not see it in my page. Click, drag over the top. We now have a master page applied to page 1, and it is in my actual page. Now, the power of this is that when we do this, things are locked, so you don't accidentally monkey with something. And then from this part, this is where you would add your additional content. So for instance, let's say we were going to add maybe a photo, and we don't know really what photo we're going to do yet. So we could use a placeholder and add a photo across the top. And maybe we want to do a circle photo down below, something kind of artistic. I know design majors, you're probably laughing at that, but for demonstration purposes only. So now that we have our two graphics, I can move these around and reorder them as I see fit. So when I did this, maybe I want to re-switch these, and let's go ahead and put these down below and this one up above. I can shrink this. If I want to confine so that I don't get this really kind of squishy looking effect, hold shift, and that will constrain to shackle so that it'll stay within the equal proportions. And now that we have this, that looks good-ish. I'm going to go ahead and put in something into those placeholders. Now, you notice that I'm trying to line this up. Here's a really helpful tool. Click on the two objects that you want to align, And then over across the top, you'll get this tool where you can actually align to center so that they actually are centered. So if I do this so that it looks very drastic, you'll notice that it now aligns it to center on both of those objects. You can also align the top, align the center for horizontal, or align to bottom as well. So now that I have that, let's go ahead and hit place. Command D, no, just kidding. Command Shift M, and that will allow you to place an object. I'm going to go ahead and place a graphic that I have in here. And now we get it into our circle. I'm going to go ahead and do the same. Command Shift M. Great. Now you may get this image policy that comes up. Whenever you're dealing with high resolution graphics, you may get this option because you don't want to chug the application because you're putting all this data as an embed, and it also makes your InDesign publisher file huge. Now, embedding is a good thing if you're trying to send this file elsewhere. Otherwise, we do linking, no differently we would in InDesign. Links can be managed through the resource manager, which is why we have the Command Shift M. It's to manage a place. I don't know what their rationale was for that, but I'll show you what the difference of these looks like in a second. Typically speaking, I still kind of default to my linking principles where we link as opposed to embed, so that we can always adjust things on the fly and also keep our size of our file down. I'm going to go ahead and, I'm going to go ahead and just link it. And just like that, it's now down the bottom. Now you may notice that the framing of this is wrong. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on this. What I'm going to do is hit Command plus. And bear in mind the same key commands that we're used to come into play. Command plus, Command minus, Command 0 to center your page. And also we can use things like the H for hand tool, or you can just use pinch and zoom if that's applicable to your machine. I'm going to go ahead and use my V for my black arrow tool. And unlike the kind of circle upon circle, kind of the old camera prism icon that they would put in a photo in InDesign, we have the simpler, more kind of common sense navigation principle. We have the zoom so we can zoom in within the frame, and then we can double click and reframe as needed, as opposed to accidentally hitting that circle and moving and such. So that's a little bit different. If we scroll down to the bottom, we can do the same thing to this photo. I'm going to go ahead and if I grab the handles of a frame, notice that it will adjust accordingly with crop. That thing of that usually confused a lot of people in InDesign, where if you grab the edge of a frame, it won't change the size. That is the opposite in a publisher. This acts as if you would think it would. If you framed an object, it will constrain it and reframe it for you. If you place a graphic, and I'll show you the difference in a second, that is not the case. You still have to crop. I'm going to go ahead and just reframe this the way that I like, double click and reframe and call it a day. Now that framing bit that I was talking about, these are frames or placeholders. And we did that by using the ones that have the strike through them. We also have this tool that is the shapes tool, and there's a lot of fun shapes. We can do things like the rectangle tool, triangle tool, stars, etc. So this is really helpful if we're trying to do a mask over the top of a graphic. So stylistically, what this would look like is, let's say I wanted to have we'll use double arrows. I'm going to go ahead and make this go across my entire double truck here, like so. Now, we can't just hit Command Shift M. Here is the placing tool. Notice that it doesn't go into the arrows, but I'll show you why I'm doing this in a second. And when we put this in, like so, it goes over the top. Over on the right-hand side, let's go ahead and open up our layers panel. And when we do this, there's two things I want to show. When you place an object that's not using a placeholder frame, when you grab the corners, it will scale accordingly. It does not do the crop that we're used to in InDesign. And even if you hold Shift, it will shrink, it'll kind of make it fat or wide as you see fit. If you hold Control, it will conform strain it along the center. And then if you hit also Option on the Mac, it'll also conform by corner or whatever handle that you grab from. Now, this is a little bit different than InDesign, and it does kind of break our muscle memory. Should we need to crop, we actually use the cropping tool, and we would crop the actual photo as we need it. Okay, so that's a little bit different. Personally, I like it better this way, but everybody might have their own different opinion when it comes to this. What I want to show is the ability to mask out using the shape tool. So for instance, if I wanted to have this masked in a shape, whether it's this vector illustration or one that you make, all I need to do is place that graphic, come over to my layer, drag and drop it underneath the element that I want it to mask. Super fast, super easy. Now, why would I do this? Well, there's a few things that might happen. When we're doing a book or a handout or whatever, we may want to do things like have columns and have text boxes and stuff. And let me show you what that looks like in this new workflow. Now, in InDesign, we're used to when we build a document, we would make column guides. You notice that didn't show up. It still exists. In Affinity, they actually have it dedicated as their own tool. So what we're going to do is go up to View. We're going to go to Guides Manager. And in Guides Manager, this is where you're able to build the guides that you want across your document. You would be able to add your guides here. So for instance, if I needed to add, let's do 3 columns across everything. Great. And let's say we wanted to change the fill. So instead of it being kind of the ruler guides that we're used to, which we can still drag from the left and make our guides accordingly, these actually kind of get grayed out, and I kind of like this interface better as opposed to having the guides, because I typically use guides for doing layout to make sure that I have my header or I have my headline aligned correctly. And now columns are just basically just grayed out in the background within our printing region, which is our margins over here. And we can go ahead and hit close, and now we have columns that go across our spread right here. So the other thing that we may want to do instead of doing it across the document is maybe we need to do it within a text box. Coming over back to our tools, I'm going to add a text frame toolbox. I'm going to make it across my entire page. Now when I do, yes, Loris Ipsum still exists. We can right mouse click and we can insert filler text, and voila, we now have filler text. We can also do things like add columns directly within the text box. So if we want it outside of the regular norm of our layout, we just want this text box to have columns, we can go ahead and add columns across the text box by just adding columns directly to the text box using our attributes bar across the top. It's located over here. As we adjust it, it'll adjust those columns based off of the width and height of your text box. I'm going to show you how we can do word wrap and also do tight word wrap or a block word wrap. So when we click on the arrow, you notice that I'm applying it to the arrow shape. If you go up to our toolbar across the top, we have these 3 icons, which will show our word wrap settings. So we can actually adjust them based off of what we need, such as if I wanted to have it as a jump, where it would jump across both the top and the bottom. If I want it blocked off or squared. Tight, where it will follow the shape, etc. We can reset the word wrap by hitting this, and we can also use this tool. This tool allows you to customize the outline of it. So for instance, if you wanted to have a little bit more offset, we can actually adjust for our word wrap. And this is nice, especially if you're trying to keep your copy or give your copy a little bit more breathing room around an object. The other thing I want to point out is the fact that we do have an image that we place. Now, any images that we have done anywhere, of course, gets kept either as embedded or as a linked object. And we would typically do that in InDesign using a different panel. Instead, in Affinity Publisher, what we're going to do is we're going to go to our Resource Manager. Now, Resource Manager, you'll find under Document, Resource Manager, to be able to check for your broken links and also locate where they are in your document. So for instance, if I was looking for this specific graphic, I can see that the status is okay. It knows where it's at on my hard drive, the fact that it's linked, the size of the graphic, the place DPI, and this is especially important if you're doing things like pre-flight, getting ready for shipping it to a printer, etc. And it'll tell me what page it's on, 1, 3, 5, whatever. So now that I've shown you a little bit about how resources are used, whether it's an asset or whether we're doing it as a Command M or using the place tool or using it out within a frame. The other things that we might want to do is perhaps do more text-based stuff. Well, we have the text box for that, and I showed you our paragraph and character styles. And if you forget what does what, paragraph is for big paragraphs, and you want each paragraph to have that style, versus a character style will be specifically a specific character or a word. Now, you may want to do something more artsy. So for instance, across this, I want to do something that is bigger and bolder and headline. Well, we can use this, which is the creative text tool. Works like the text tool, except you see each individual character. So for instance, I'm going to say analog to digital. Now, what this allows me to do is this adds it as its own layer. And now I can set this as if I have a specific style. I can also drop that style down and frame this up as we see it. And this, like I said, is a nice tool, especially if you're doing things as headlines and stuff. I would probably gravitate towards this tool as opposed to doing it as just a framed text tool, because you're typically doing it as a one-line, one-hit type of a thing. So, of course, now that I've applied that, what I could do is take this and set this as its own paragraph style, and that way I could keep it and reuse it later. Because again, I wouldn't want to, say, update this character style, because then it would update my style that I used up here. So if I did that, notice that that changed up there. So that wouldn't quite be a good use of that tool. In my case, I would actually highlight this if this was going to be a reoccurring headline throughout my publication, and I would actually set this as a proper paragraph style. Now, the last bit that I want to kind of cover is I'm going to jump between two different documents. So I have this test for workshop. I see that asterisk. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Command Save. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Open Recent. And I'm going to go to a publication that I made that kind of shows all the different stuff that I was covering. And this is kind of my recap for you. Units and master pages is what I started off with. And you can set that up within your initial document setup, or you could also change it later if you need to. If you go over to document setup, your document units are right there. Your master pages, again, is the master sheets that you can apply throughout the entire document. And if those get updated, it updates accordingly across all of your documents. Column guides, you'll find under your guides manager in your toolbar. We went through the interface and we went through the various different ways of placing, whether you're using the command or if you're using the resource manager, so you can double check that your color space and everything is the same. And also I went over how you could use the frame tool, which is how I prefer to do layout. That way I have that more intuitive interface of zooming in and reshifting as opposed to cropping a placed graphic. Text boxes, we showed how we can have our columns added to it. Spillover text is something that I forgot to cover. And spillover text acts exactly the same way as we expected. And this is if you're trying to make different columns spread across and you want the content to continue. If we wanted to add a spillover, we would just come over to this white triangle and then grab the spillover text. And what's nice is you will also see the following arrow where it shows where it's following the previous column and where you're spilling over to. Word wrap, the various different word wraps that you can do. And the only other thing I really wanted to cover is the exporting part of this whole thing. So when we export, at this time, there is no packaging. And this is kind of the one knock I have against Affinity Publisher right now. I wish I had a better option, but collecting resources. And what this will allow you to do is point to a single folder that has these resources as you're building your document. So let me explain. In the case of the document that we were doing earlier, let's say I wanted to have all of this, the photos, not font. You'll have to do that outside of this at this time. But let's say I wanted to send this to a colleague of mine because I know he could do some touching up and working on this for me. I'm going to go ahead and hit File and Save like I normally would. And then what I'm going to do is go over to Document Resource Manager. And what I'm going to do is either A, embed these graphics into this document, or I can do what's called a collect. And what collect will do is that I can select these graphics, hit collect, and I can set it to a folder where I see fit. I'm going to call it links, no differently than I would in InDesign. And I'm going to go ahead and hit collect. You'll notice that all of those assets now are put into that folder, and we can then ship it with the document to our colleague. Now, the other thing that I would encourage you to do is also whatever fonts you use, go ahead and just throw it in that folder as well. That way your colleague will also have the same fonts as well. Now, when we do this, we're going to run into the same thing that we're used to in InDesign, relinking. So let me show you that process really quickly. So you see, I just tried to open up this AF Pub, which is Affinity Publisher file, and we get something that's kind of reminds me of InDesign. What we can do is it's going to ask if we can relink our resources. I'm going to hit yes, of course. And what this will do is it will ask me where these resources are at for this spread, and then I can relink them. So for instance, I see that this one's missing. I can then hit replace and then go to my computer where those resources are, and it will relink it for you. Again, this gets you out of the Creative Cloud ecosystem if you're feeling like you're being trapped or held ransom, or you feel like you don't want to keep paying $50 or $60 a month if you're paying for Creative Cloud yourself. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me either through my blogs or through my email. I'm happy to help you however I can. And hopefully this gets you a little bit closer to getting your creative inspirations down to pen and paper, or ink to paper.